Hey, glad you made it today. My name's Shane Wood. I work for the Association for Biblical Higher Education, but my claim to fame is I'm married to this beautiful woman right down here. Her name's Gayla, so I get to be Gayla's husband, and I'm the father to three great kids. Shayla, Mackenzie, who's the little one you kind of see sometimes out in the hallway listening with her earphones on. Not supposed to have her earphones on, but sometimes she does. And I'm the dad to Michael, who's your associate pastor. And for some reason, my son said, "Hey, Dad, would you like to preach?" I said, "That'd be great." And he decided then to go to Omaha. I don't know why. And I really want you to know I appreciate him. He's being written out of the will because he decided the Sunday that I should preach is Time Change Weekend. Now, I want you to know, when you do Time Change Weekend and it's the weekend that you fall back, that's the best weekend to preach a message. Because everybody shows up, they're in a great mood, they've had an extra hour of sleep. I mean, the praise the Lords are multiple, it's awesome. But on this weekend, the weekend where we spring forward, everybody wakes up late, they're already behind, they've lost an hour of sleep, and yeah, I really love Jesus. So Michael, I know you're watching on video at some point along the week. You left, and I'm here, and I have the stage. Mwahaha. My job is to work with Bible colleges, but I also happen to be an instructor at a couple of Christian universities. And probably my default mode is to kind of fall into teacher mode. And so if you don't mind, since I don't know you and you don't know me very well, I'd like to start off our morning with a pop quiz. Because that's what teachers do. You know, they drop pop quizzes on first-time students. Now, I promise you're likely going to pass this exam. But in a way to kind of set the stage for what we're talking about, I'm going to give you 3 dates. And those dates are fairly famous. In response, you give me what those dates have come to represent, all right? First one's very easy. December 7th, 1941. That's Pearl Harbor, yeah, okay, very good, okay? You got 1 out of 1, good. November 22nd, 1963. That's right, it was some of you said John F. Kennedy. It was the John F. Kennedy assassination. Now, what you may not realize, that's also the day, for some of you who are literature buffs, that's also the day that C.S. Lewis, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that's the day he died. Okay, some people don't know that. And then September 11th, 2001. That's 9/11. That's when the terrorists flew airplanes into the World Trade Towers and into the Pentagon. See, those are pretty famous dates, and the reason partly that they're famous is that those dates have come to stir something within us. They stir emotion. Now, for some, the emotions of those dates are experienced only in history books. But for others, the emotion, even maybe of the earliest one, is as fresh as the breath you are taking right this moment. That's the way it is with those kind of dates. Dates that represent uncertainty over life cut short, or sadness over expectations that will go unmet, or fear over dreams that will never be lived out. Unexpected events, uncertain times. Sound familiar? We may be living in one of those times right now. In fact, I was reflecting in the first service. It was a year ago tomorrow that I preached the last sermon that I've preached. I preached at Kissimmee Christian, my home church. And I preached the last sermon before we went into lockdown. Uncertain times. You know, when we face those times, it's in those moments, people want to know. I remember a year ago, people were asking, does anyone care? Is anyone in charge who can fix what's going on? Is there anything I can count on? Now, it's that way in crisis events like those dates that you're seeing behind me. I would suggest to you that maybe it's just that way about life in general. I think John experienced this kind of life, uncertainty, unexpectedness. Angelina read for us Revelation chapter 1. Look what he says. If you have your Bible, we're going to be there all morning. So if you want to stay in this passage in the Revelation chapter 1, if you have your Bibles, otherwise it'll be on the screen. Look what he says. I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. On the Lord's day, I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet which said, write on a scroll, what you see and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamum, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. Now, John goes out of his way to say, I was on the island of Patmos. Now, that seems a little bit obscure, doesn't it? Why does John identify where he's at? Maybe for John, maybe Patmos for John is the island of unrealized expectations, unfulfilled dreams. See, John's writing to 7 churches, some sin-ridden, some suffering, all of them struggling in some manner. 7 churches, all within about a 50-mile radius of Patmos, where John is right now. In fact, it's not beyond the pale of thought to think that John had probably visited every one of the churches he identifies at one time in his life, but not now. Now John says, I'm on the island of Patmos. And John knows why you go to Patmos. Oh, the emperor says, you go to Patmos to mine copper. John knows better. You go to Patmos to die. And it's not so much maybe that John is bugged about being on Patmos as much as why he's there. He says, I am there because of my faith in Christ. How many times do you suppose John asked himself, is there anyone out there? Is there anyone who cares? Is there anyone in charge? I mean, I say what I'm supposed to say. I do what I'm supposed to do. I stand where I'm supposed to stand, and look where it's gotten me. Some of you can identify. Some of you have been to Patmos. Some of you may be there right now. You know what it's like to live in a world of uncertainty, of unrealized expectations, of unfulfilled dreams. That likable young pastor that you were getting to know didn't stay. The promotion you desired didn't materialize. The financing you'd hoped for didn't go through. That family you invested so much time and energy in didn't make it. The disease, the virus, the cancer didn't go away. If you've ever felt the crush of the walls around you, then you likely have been to Patmos once or twice yourself. And if you've been there on Patmos, you know the desperation. You know the pressure. And when the pressure rises, friends, remember what it is that John sees. When the pressure rises and the walls come crashing down, do what John did. Turn to the one who's really in charge. Because John, in his moment of uncertainty, he discovered again Jesus was in charge. Look in verse 10, there's a little bit of background. John says, it came about on the Lord's day that I was in the Spirit. Now, that's probably a way of saying that John was worshiping. That's probably what John's trying to say. On the Lord's day, I was in the Spirit. He's probably saying, I was worshiping the Messiah, and that would be something worth noting. Because when is it most difficult to usually tell Jesus how much we love him? When everything's going just the way we want? Or is it a little hard to tell Jesus how much we love him when things aren't playing out the way we want, the way we hope, the way we'd expected? When we feel like Jesus has let us down, when we're suffering in pain. John, in spite of his situation, says, I was in the Spirit, and he says, and I heard a voice like a trumpet, which throughout the history of God's people carries a real strong significance. It was primarily used to represent that image, one of two things. Either when a trumpet blast occurred among the people of God, it was a call to battle or a call to repentance. And maybe now John, while he's worshiping, even if you read the rest of the book of the Revelation, and in this passage right here, maybe both of those things, a call to repent and a call to prepare for battle. Maybe John, when he sees this Son of Man, maybe that's what he's doing. He's repenting and preparing for the time. Because you see that in verse 13. John turned, he hears this trumpet voice. He turns around to see it is who's that's speaking to him. And he sees a vision among the 7 golden lampstands, which you find out at the end of this passage are the churches of Christ. he turns and he sees someone standing in the middle of the lampstands. And it's someone dressed like the Son of Man. Now, friends, that's a big term, Son of Man. Many of you know that Jesus used that terminology about himself, but the first time it was used was in the Old Testament. In Daniel chapter 7, where the prophet of God is interceding for the people of God. They're in captivity. They are in uncertain times. And there the prophet is praying for the people of God. Now, generations later, John finds himself in a very similar situation. And in the moment of his greatest need, John sees what Daniel saw. He sees someone dressed like a Son of Man. That term came to be used, came to represent the protector, the provider, the guide, the guard of God's people during troubled and uncertain times. Now, friends, I would suggest that maybe our times aren't much different than the times of John and Daniel. And I would suggest to you, when you find yourself on the island of Patmos, we can discover who it is that provides and protects and guards and guides. We, as Christ's church, as well. There are some preachers and some scholars who have suggested that the imagery of the Son of Man, the way he is described, is not simply trying to draw a pretty picture, that each image that John identifies is actually communicating a message to the people of God. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to spend the balance of our time this morning unpacking a little bit about these images and what they might represent for you as the people of God in uncertain times as well. For example, if John were here, he probably would encourage you to embrace the Son of Man because his hair is white like snow. You see that image in chapter 1, verse 14, don't you? White hair that's white like snow. You know, we live in a culture where white hair has lost much of its luster. In fact, for many in our culture, white hair, gray hair, it reminds people of what lies ahead. And that's usually a place that many younger people don't want to go. In fact, for many people in our culture today, there's only one thing worse than having white or gray hair, and that is to have no hair. That's right. Very good. But I want you to know that white hair, gray hair, while the youth-obsessed culture may look down on it, God doesn't. In fact, in Solomon's writings in the Proverbs chapter 16, verse 31, Solomon writes, gray hair is a crown of splendor. It's attained by a righteous life. Gray hair, white hair reveals a person who's been around the block of life a few times. Reality is, friends, that age does something to an individual. Now, I know, again, living in our youth-obsessed culture, that many people who are younger would say, you're right. We're not exactly sure what it is that age does to a person, but whatever it is, it's got to be bad. I mean, look at them. Okay, let's look at them for a moment. Consider a few white-haired seniors that you know. Is it just me, or is it perhaps true that spending time with a few white-haired seniors might serve a few green-eared kids? Might do a world of good. Now that's because white hair is a sign of wisdom. It's a sign of experience. And no one has more wisdom and experience than God. In fact, throughout much of the scriptures, God's persona, especially in the Old Testament, is identified as the Ancient of Days. One of the temptations of not paying attention to the wisdom of age is the temptation to try to figure out things on your own. Especially when you're younger, you kind of want to set your footing on the ground and you kind of want to figure out how life's supposed to be. I can identify with this. 40 years ago last fall, I started high school. Now, in my high school, back in the mid-'80s, that'll date myself a little bit, we would have an orientation, and freshmen were encouraged to attend. It wasn't required, but they were encouraged. Well, I want you to know, being the hot ninth grade guy that I was, I didn't need orientation. I had it all figured out. And so, of course, the first day of school, I arrived to get my schedule and my locker assignment, but as life would have it, we were delayed, and so I was in a big hurry. So I ran, got my locker assignment, got my schedule, couldn't put my books away. I didn't realize that when they gave you a code, one of the numbers on that code identified the floor you're supposed to meet on. I didn't know 407 meant I was supposed to be in 4th floor. I found the first room I could with people in it. It was 1st floor shop, wood shop class. And that would have been okay, except the wood shop class in first hour that year were all seniors. So in walks this hot freshman guy that I was, thinking I had my act completely together. I walk into this room completely lost and said, hey, I'm supposed to be in English. This is obvious not English. Can you guys give me directions to where I'm supposed to be? To which one of the seniors said, oh, no problem. We'll be glad to help you out. And they gave me directions, and I followed it exactly to a letter right out into the parking lot. That's the danger, trying to figure it out on your own. Now, friends, God encourages us to ask questions and to ask for help. But He reminds us, He's not a freshman. He's not a junior or senior. He's the teacher. And Jesus says, you can ask me if you're in tough times. I've been around the block of life. In fact, God says, I created the block. So when you face uncertain times, come to me. I have wisdom to share. If John were here, he'd say, embrace the Son of Man because his hair is white like snow and his eyes blaze like fire. You also see that image in chapter 1, verse 14. Look again. Eyes that blaze like fire. Now, whereas white hair maybe represents wisdom, eyes might represent reliable correction. That's because eyes have a way of changing what we do, don't they? I mean, think about it. When we drive our cars, we can do basically what we want when we want behind the wheel. We can change the radio stations, we can make phone calls, we can change lanes without signaling, we can exceed the speed limit. As you can tell, I live in Orlando. Basically, when we're behind the wheels of our car, we can do what we want without anyone to tell us what we should or shouldn't do. That is, until a set of eyes lock onto us. You know the set of eyes, don't you? The eyes that were passing in a direction opposite of you suddenly are turned around, now following behind you. A set of eyes that were reading numbers on a dashboard screen, now reading numbers on your license plate. Eyes have a way of changing what we do. Moms have this ability. Moms have this ability. I remember my friends, my brother and I, we lived in an apartment complex, and there was a little playground where we could peek out our bedroom windows onto the playground, and we'd go down there and we'd set a little trap, and we thought we were really creative, and we'd sneak back up to our room, peek through the blinds, watch the trap go off. We'd get a hee ha ha, little kids. We'd go downstairs. We thought we were kings of the world, only to discover my mother walked me through each step we had just done, right down to the trap that had been sprung. And when we'd go see our friends again, 3 months later, we would see our friends and they'd say, where you been? And I'd say, well, we thought we'd gotten away with something and Mom kind of walked right through everything. And our friends would say, man, Shane, you can't get away with anything with Mom. Don't you know? She knows everything. And I said, why? And my friend quoted to me what's been quoted to every set of children since Eve. You can't pull anything off on Mom because Mom, she's got eyes in the back of her heads. They said that to you too, didn't they? That's right. Now, were my friends calling my mom a mutant? Of course not. They were simply trying to communicate that my mom has an awareness. She has a set of eyes that don't miss a thing that her children are doing or things that are happening to her children at all. She has an awareness. Now, friends, God has a set of eyes. He has a set of eyes and an awareness. His eyes are aware of all that is, all that's happening around you, all that's happening to you. Solomon says in Proverbs chapter 15, verse 3, the eyes of the Lord are everywhere, keeping watch over the wicked and the good. He says in chapter 5, verse 21, human ways are under the eyes of the Lord, and he examines all their paths. God is watching, and nothing escapes his sight. Some of you have been wondering, and you should know, God is aware of what's happening to us. Whether it's a demagogue leader in Asia or a missing leader at Adventure Christian. Whether it's fear of another violent outbreak in major cities across the country or a viral outbreak at a local school. God's aware when cultures and even the church, even churches come flying apart at the seams and no one seems to bat an eye. Be assured, God's watching. But he's watching with a purpose. See, this Son of Man, he has eyes, but John goes on to say he has eyes that blaze like fire. Now, fire was a common biblical image. It was often used in the refinement of metal in John's day. It was said that in John's day, ore, different types of ore, iron ore, gold ore, silver ore, would come to certain regional centers. And the goldsmiths, what they were known for is they would get these shipments of ore, unrefined, into their areas, and these goldsmiths would fire up these incredible flames underneath these large vats. And the flames would become so intense that at one point, all the metal would begin to fall to the bottom of that vat, and the dross and the slag would rise to the surface. And then it was said that when the goldsmith had timed it right, and the fire had been just hot enough, he would walk over to his instrument wall and he would pull an instrument off his wall. He'd take that, it'd be a long piece of metal, and he'd put it over the edges of the vat, and he would pull it across the top of the vat, and it would move all the slag and dross to the side. And then the goldsmith would know the gold was ready to be minted. He would climb up on a ladder or scaffold, and he would look down into the vat, and he would know when it was ready. When he would look into it and it was pure enough, it was as he was looking in a mirror, looking at himself. Maybe that's why the Apostle Peter says in chapter 1, Maury read part of that passage this morning. In verse 7, the Apostle Peter says that we have a faith in Jesus that is more precious than gold or silver when it has been refined by fire. The Son of Man has eyes that blaze like fire. So can I ask you, are you willing to live under the watchful eyes of God? Are you ready to have Jesus watch the movies that you watch and read the books that you read and visit the websites that you visit? Are you ready to have Jesus speak the language that you speak and handle the money in the way that you handle it and participate in the habits that you participate in? Are we essentially, friends, willing to live in God's line of sight? And if we're not, what would it take for us to become ready? Because the Son of Man has eyes that blaze like fire. He's aware of everything. See, if John were here, he'd say, embrace the Son of Man because his hair is white like snow and his eyes blaze like fire. And you need to stand where Jesus stands because his feet are like bronze. You see that in verse 15 of chapter 1 in the book of the Revelation. Feet. You know, the things that people stand on. We use them for balance. We use them for our foundation. I used to live in the Midwest of the United States, and there they have basements. Don't have a lot of basements in Florida. Had some basements in the Midwest. And I discovered most construction people in the Midwest, they're pretty bright people. Because there's a frost issue in the Midwest where we lived, when they would build a house, they would dig a hole in the ground, and the first thing they would do is they would put down footings so that they set them deep in the ground, and then they lay the foundation. And the thought was, if the footings and the foundations were done right, you could build any type of house and it could be supported. But if the footings and the foundations were wrong, or if there'd been a result of shoddy workmanship, it didn't matter how pretty the building was. Eventually, the whole edifice was going to come crashing down. Now, John says that the Son of Man has feet, and they're feet of bronze. Maybe, whereas white hair represents wisdom and eyes that blaze like fire represent reliable correction, maybe feet of bronze represent a sure foundation. So let me ask you, what are you building your future on? That new job? The positive doctor's report? That sizable nest egg? Jesus invites you to build your future upon a strong footing, upon a life where His feet stand. Because where the feet of Jesus stands will be the place where we stand best as well. That's because Christ's feet glow like bronze. Bronze. Not iron. I mean, iron in John's day, very common metal. Be incredibly strong, but didn't last very long. Wasn't copper. Copper, also a common metal in John's day, extraordinarily durable, but pretty flimsy. But bronze, an alloy of tin and copper melded together, well, that gave that metal the best of both qualities. Bronze is incredibly solid and lasts forever. Jesus invites you to build your future by building a relationship with Him. In Jesus you find hope. In Jesus you find a promise. In Jesus you find a life that is both powerful and permanent. Our Jesus is the foundation where we can stand. And if John were here, he'd encourage us to embrace the Son of Man, because when he speaks, well, his voice is like the sound of rushing waters. And whereas white hair represents wisdom and eyes that blaze like fire represent reliable correction, and feet that glow like bronze represent a sure foundation, a voice of the sound of rushing waters, well, perhaps that's an image of undeniable authority. Undeniable authority, because is it not true, even in our culture, that there's something about the volume of a voice? I mean, it seems like even in today's world, especially on TV talk shows and personal interviews, if someone speaks loudest and longest, it draws attention. Have you noticed? Talk loud enough and long enough, and it doesn't matter how lame an idea someone's got, someone will listen. That's because there's something about the volume of a voice that gets our attention. Parents, we know this, don't we? I mean, we work from a very early age with our children to know the difference between the voices. You know the voices, right? The inside voice and the outside voice. An inside voice is calm and quiet, and the outside voice, you can kind of just let her go. My daughter Mackenzie, I talked about her just a few moments ago. My daughter Mackenzie, she's the little gal. When she was born, she was very young. She was born basically at a birth life at about 26 and a half weeks. When she was born, she weighed 1 pound, 3 ounces. That's a little bit more than a can of Coke. Her whole body fit in the size of my hand. I could take off my wedding ring and slide it over her arm up to her shoulder. When she was born, the doctor said the conditions of her lung was the consistency of wet toilet paper. And when she was born, it was kind of an emergency situation. I couldn't hear her cry. Now, the doctor said he did. The nurse said that they heard her. But as soon as she was born, she was intubated for oxygen. She was on oxygen for several months, almost 18 months. We might have left her on the oxygen a little too long, because she's 24 years old and the volume issue has resolved itself. Okay? I mean, Mackenzie, when she speaks, the whole world knows it. In fact, Gayla and I even just recently have had to work with the difference between the inside voice and the outside voice. Do you know God's got an inside voice and an outside voice? God's got an inside voice. You read about it in 1 Kings chapter 18. The prophet Elijah's been on the run from King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. Jezebel's promised, "You're a dead man, Elijah." And so he's been on the run. He's been to Mount Carmel, and they've had the prophets of Baal. And now Jezebel says, "You're finished." He's been on the run for several days. He finds himself in a cave. And he's had it. Maybe some of you can relate. He's just done. In fact, he basically says, God, just take my life. He goes in there, he falls asleep, and in his moment of greatest need, instead of giving orders, God shows up and ministers to Elijah. An angel brings him water and food and lets him sleep. And at some part of the story, God's ready for him to get moving again, and Elijah doesn't seem too interested. God sends a great wind through a cavern, through the canyon where the cave that Elijah is in, and Elijah doesn't pay attention. And then there's this great earthquake that shakes the rocks, and Elijah's not impressed. And then there's a fire in the valley, and Elijah doesn't move. And then a small breeze blows through the canyon, the cavern and the cave where Elijah is at. And Elijah grabs up his stuff and runs out because he knows God is near. In that moment of brokenness, God used his inside voice with Elijah. God's got an inside voice. And friends, God's got an outside voice too. And someday, he's going to use it. It's an outside voice that no one's going to mistake. There will be no danger in missing God's outside voice. Jesus promises Christ's followers, one day, all the droning, monotonous noise that our world is so effective at creating is one day going to fall silent before him. No questions. But don't be fooled. It's not only a voice for the future. The voice of God that sounds like rushing waters is a voice that is already a voice of power and influence. Some of you have read the Revelation. Some of you are aware that the book defines Jesus in many ways. Alpha, Omega, true, living one, King of kings, Lord of lords. Friends, that's ruler talk. Ruler. Kingship. It doesn't matter how loud others talk, friends. Jesus is still the ruler today. He's ruler over Joe Biden and Ron DeSantis and Shane Wood. Jesus is ruler over Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Ted Turner. Jesus is ruler over Harry and Meghan, Beyonce and Jay-Z, Homer and Marge. He's ruler over The Bachelor, The Apprentice, The Survivor. Jesus is ruler over Dr. Fauci and Dr. Seuss, canceled or not. He's ruler over angels and demons, saints and sinners. Jesus is ruler over Satan himself. And that suggests that he intends to rule over you and me, too. So does he? Is Jesus your ruler? Is what Jesus wants the final rule of what's important in your life? In this church? Is he the final rule of what's important? Or have we forgotten, even in the church, that the church isn't a democracy? The church is a kingdom. And she's already got a king. Do we want what we want? Or do we want what Jesus wants? What Jesus wants. That's what matters. If John were here, we could talk about other images like sword out of the mouth, stars in the right hand. Important images, but it'd be a shame to focus on the individual images and miss the picture, the big picture. It's there in Revelation chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. Look what John says. When I saw him, this Son of Man, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead. And behold, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys to death and Hades. And you know what that means, friends? It means it doesn't matter whether you're mining copper on Patmos, dreaming big dreams in Persia, or pausing for church at Adventure. And it doesn't matter whether you're the prophet Daniel or the apostle John, or just little old you. Jesus is the one really in charge. And he remains so today. There was an individual who kind of grasped that. I remember a pastor in Omaha, Nebraska, where I used to live, telling the story of a member of his church. He was an older gentleman by the time the pastor that I knew met him, but early on, he told the story, early on in this man's life, he had kind of lived his high school days doing things for himself, but upon graduation from high school and early days of college, he decided it was time for a change. And a change he made was to turn his life over to Christ. He got real serious about the faith that he had kind of played with through the teenage years. He took up a Bible and started reading it and read almost all the way through when he came across a passage in 2 Timothy chapter 1. Maybe you've read it before. It's in the context of Paul not being ashamed of the gospel. And the passage is, I know whom I believed, and I'm persuaded that he's able to keep that which I've committed to him against that day. You find it in verse 12. And that young man was so moved that he said, I'm going to make this my life verse. And he went ahead and finished the rest of the Bible, but every time he had an opportunity, he would quote that verse to himself. When he would apply for a job, he'd be having in the back of his mind, now I know whom I believed, and I'm persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed to him against that day. And he decided to take a job or not based on that verse. And he met a young woman, and while they got serious, he said, before we get too serious, you need to know something. I've made a change in my life, and I'm committed to Jesus. And he says, my life verse is, I know whom I believed, and I'm persuaded that he's able to keep that which I've committed to him against that day. And she said, I'm also a believer. And they married together and built their marriage upon that thought. When they would wake up in the morning, they would quote that verse to each other, I know whom I believed, and I'm persuaded that he's able to keep that which I've committed to him against that day. And when they would lay in the bed next to each other as they drift off to sleep, the words of that passage, I know whom I've believed, and I am persuaded that he's able to keep that which I've committed to him against that day, be the last words in their minds as they drift off to sleep. Their family grew, and when their children were brought into the family, they would tuck their little ones in, and from a very early age, the mom and dad would get down and kiss the child and whisper in their ear, sometimes not even knowing that the child was awake, but they would whisper, I know whom I've believed. That couple grew old together, and as sometimes happens, the older gentleman had a medical emergency one day at a restaurant. They rushed the gentleman and his wife to the hospital. They rushed the man into the ER. They did some work and kind of triage. The doctor came out, talked to the wife, and she'd called her oldest son who lived in the area, and he'd come. The doctor came out and said, well, it's kind of serious. We think he's had a stroke. We need you to get him to talk and to remember anything that he can remember, to talk with you, to help in the transition period. And so they walked in together, the wife on one side of the gurney, the son on the other. And mom and son were talking a little bit, and then they remembered, oh yeah, we're supposed to talk to dad. And so the son said, Dad, we're here. We want you to know we're here. And they need us to talk to you, and they need you to talk to us. So Dad, we know that you know your life verse. Share with us your life verse. And the gentleman, through the drugs and his haze, was able to speak out the words, committed to him. Committed to him. As sometimes happens in those kind of moments, the gentleman didn't get better. It was a few weeks later, and the rest of the family had joined the mom and the oldest son, and they were all in the room together, and they were singing and praying, knowing that Dad's time for departure was at hand. And it just so happened that the mom was at the head of the bed, and the oldest son, was again at the head of the bed. And there came a moment where the oldest son, things grew quiet, and the oldest son looked at his father in the presence of everyone and said, Dad, we're all here, and we know you're ready to go. Your whole life's been about this. But we're going to be here remaining. One more time, Dad. One more time. Can you tell us what's driven your whole life? And the old man, through parched lips and glassy eyes, came to and was able to speak out. Him. Him. And friends, at the end of all days, that's really all it's about. It's about you and him. Let's pray together.